In the summer of 21, the year of the staycation, at a time I look back at the calm, clement weather, rather than the rain, wind and storms we've recently had, I avoided the beaches and resorts of Wales and instead spent some time in Merthyr Tydfil. A strange traveller's location perhaps, given this town has a reputation of being one of the most deprived in Wales, indeed Britain. Although it does rank as one of the cheapest places to buy in the country. If you're not familiar with Britain, Merthyr is post-industrial, part of the Rust Belt. But it holds some surprises, some stunning countryside. The Brecon Beacons National Park is on its doorstep. There's a heritage railway, 3 extreme golf courses, of which one has a Norman castle in the grounds. Although stripped of stone, you can make out its defences, and it actually has a dungeon, or dijon, the French word for keep, or tower, except on this occasion the dijon or dungeon really is subterranean. Merthyr is as good a place to explore the Industrial Revolution and the social revolutions it generated. In 1831, the working people rose up and rebelled, flying the red flag of revolution for the first time in Britain and fighting off the British military in pitched battles that led to multiple casualties on both sides. They also embarked on a Fight Club-style action of destroying all the records of debt held in the town and recovering property from the bailiffs. Merthyr and many towns in this part of South Wales grew because of geology and its importance as a source of commerce in the form of clay, iron, limestone and coal, the very building blocks of the Industrial Revolution. And it led to huge leaps in understanding about the science. The English surveyor William Smith had been employed to survey mines and canal cuttings at the beginning of the 19th century. His interest in fossils, he discovered in his journeys, allowed for the dating and identification of rocks and led him to create the first geological map of England and Wales in 1815. It was the first comprehensive geological map of anywhere. Science, along with greed and invention, drove the Industrial Revolution, which in turn saw a new age of enlightenment that advanced science, particularly geology, which had been held back by the persistent belief in the religious notions of a young Earth. But to understand this revolution, we need to go back in time. Back in time to understand the geological forces that made this a cradle of industry, the time when the raw materials of revolution, limestone, iron and coal, were formed. So come with me way back, nearly 400 million years, when Wales was part of a little continent we call Avalonia, when it was south of the equator. I'm actually going to go back in time nearly 500 million years just to show off this very cool website, dinosaurpictures.org. It was a time when volcanoes were thrown up in the Snowdonia, and England and Wales were making their first Brexit from the supercontinent of Gondwana and headed north to join North America, Scotland and Scandinavia. Any ancient space traveller viewing this little Class M planet would see most of the landmass, Gondwana, located around the South Pole. About 400 million years ago, South Wales is located here, the little continent of Avalonia being gently crashed into 2 other continents, Baltica and Laurentia, and as they did, Scotland became a new neighbour, and in the process a great mountain range was pushed up as tall as the Alps, traces of which can be found in Canada, America and Scotland. This Caledonian mountain range was pushed up high, and quickly eroding, in geological terms, as it was exposed to the elements. Great rivers wearing away the billion-year-old sandstone, dumping the sand in the area of South Wales and southwest England. Layer after layer of red sand was washed and blown down to form sediment after sediment of old red sandstone. It was identified in Devon, hence the period of 420 million years ago to the beginning of the Carboniferous about 360 million years ago, is known as the Devonian. It was a period when nature experimented with fish. Land plants were little more than mosses, although these mosses turned into tall, alien-looking trees, and the only land animals were scorpions and insects. The lack of land vegetation meant that soil was a novelty, hence a rather sandy environment. The remnants of the sandy plains are found in the mountains north of Merthyr, the Brecon Beacons. Of course, they weren't mountains back then, just an arid plain with the odd lake and river. This plain stretched across to Pembrokeshire and south to Devon, filling in the South Wales Basin. In the west, mountain building from about 300 million years ago from the south has buckled these sediments. We are familiar with mountains being pushed up by plate tectonics as continental plates barge into each other, but this also causes the opposite to mountain building as well: depressions in the land or subsidence. This South Wales Basin was then filled in with the next major rock we encounter as we head south from the Brecon Beacons. It's limestone. This period is the Carboniferous. It means coal-bearing and was given the name by the Victorian geologists because of the wealth of coal. In the early Carboniferous, the Donatian epoch, between about 363 and 325 million years ago, South Wales was under a tropical shallow sea, full of life, corals, mollusks and fish, the bones and shells falling to the sea floor to form limestone. Add to this was mud eroded from the land, as rocks were weathered and washed into the sea, so a chemical reaction occurred between any calcium in the rock and carbon dioxide in the air, adding to the calcium-rich sediment that was then lithified, i.e. turned into rock, and it makes up most of the limestone landscape north of Merthyr and along the north of the valleys of South Wales. Limestone has multiple uses. Crushed, it makes for good road building stone, and as a ballast to be used in railways. When cooked and melted in kilns, it creates lime, used to sweep the soil to improve fertility. This kiln on the Devon coast was fed with Welsh coal and limestone, and the rock is used also for building lime, cement and plaster used in Victorian times, and in iron making. Limestone is added to the furnace and acts as a flux. It grabs hold of impurities, particularly sand, silica. Limestone, calcium carbonate, releases its carbon when heated, which goes off to form a bond with oxygen, and the calcium oxide then grabs silica to form calcium silicate, which is called slag. It is less dense than molten iron, so floats to the top and can be skimmed off. In the quarries around Merthyr, you can see the individual strata, the layers of sediment, as they were laid over 300 million years ago. Further to the west in Gower, the limestone has been exposed to the sea, creating a very alien landscape dissolved by the water. It's also extremely tricky to negotiate. Limestone is very porous. Water would dissolve it, creating a distinctive landscape of pavements and hollows, which is called karst. Water quickly permeates the limestone landscape, forming underground streams and caves. In Lemurian times of the Carboniferous period, about 326 to 313 million years ago, the continents joined up again to form a new supercontinent.
300 million years ago, there was no Africa, Asia, Americas, or Europe. Just one big supercontinent. Pangaea.
In the process, a new mountain range was pushed up and called the Varascan Mountains, which in turn buckled the level sediments of Old Red Sandstone and the Carboniferous limestone, the latter being visible as spectacular limestone cliffs in Gower. To the north of South Wales lay a mountain range that stretched east to Belgium. Once called St George's Land, it has the less romantic name of the Wales Brabant Massif now. From this minor mountain range, fast-flowing streams carried sand and sediment to cover the limestone in a shallow inland sea. It forms the local rock millstone grit, sandstone with just the right size sand grains to make for millstones. There are also strata of mudstones and siltstones mixed in. And this geology forms the dramatic waterfall country on the edge of the Brecon Beacon National Park. It is only in the late Carboniferous period, from about 312 million years ago to just under 300 million years ago, the bizarre tropical rainforests colonized this part of South Wales. About 100 million years before, the first plants started experimenting with life in more hostile environment of land. The descendants of those first plants can be found in damp, shaded areas like forests and beside streams, things like the liverwort family, primitive ferns and mosses, and that required a moist environment for spores to travel so as to reproduce, but to keep themselves alive given that they had not developed tough roots. These first land plants developed into tall tree-like plants. Evolution discovered a new material, lignin. Cellulose has been around since the first green algae, many hundreds of millions of years earlier. It's pretty tough, and we use it to make paper and cellophane. But lignin is the next step in being tough. It's a polymer. Whereas cellulose, cell walls, are susceptible to frost and heat and being eaten, lignin is literally wood, enabling plants to grow taller, bigger, and with the roots that could go deeper. In the Carboniferous period, trees certainly went for taller, although their roots had some catching up to do. And being swamp trees, the roots had plenty of nutrients. It was during the Carboniferous that fish in these swamps evolved fins that were more adapted to clamber around roots and who could also breathe air. Whereas the Devonian was the age of fish, the Carboniferous became the age of amphibians. With so much plant life, oxygen levels increased to about 30%, it's 20% now, of the atmosphere, and CO2 decreased. All this extra oxygen allowed animals that breathed through their bodies, rather than having lungs, got big, really big. Dragonflies the size of birds, and centipedes the length of a car. Up in the Scottish island of Arran, the footprints of these giant centipedes have been fossilized. The South Wales Basin was not covered in rainforest and swamp for the entirety of the late Carboniferous period. Over the 13-odd million years, a great ice sheet formed on the South Pole, with pulses of warm and cooler periods, each time seeing the sea level rise and fall, inundating the forests and washing sand and silt over the buried swamps, sometimes 10 to 20 meters deep in decaying plant matter, or peat. As the weight of fresh sediment piled on top, so the water was pushed out of the peat, the pressure and heat transforming into coal over millions of years. The lower the coal seam, the more pressure and heat has been exerted, and more water has been pushed out, and hence the higher quality of the coal. Due to the commercial importance of coal, surveyors drew accurate illustrations of the coal seams and the sedimentary rocks in between in cross-section. As a particular thick and valuable coal seam would have been laid at the same time, then it would be possible to dig down and find that seam many miles apart. This imagery was brought to life famously by Sir Richard Burton, and later recited in the 2014 film Pride.
My father, who was apparently a great miner, in the days before mechanization and so on, when you got the great seam, there's a great seam, a famous seam, a world-famous one, which I believe is called the Great Atlantic Fault, and it starts in northern Spain, in the Basque country, and it goes under the Bay of Biscay, and it comes up in South Wales, and it goes under the Atlantic, and comes up in Pennsylvania. So that if you took a Basque miner or a Welsh miner or a Pennsylvania miner, and if you could blindfold them and transport them, and they know the coal face the minute they saw it, I believe it's 4 feet 6 inches. And my father used to talk about it as some men will talk about women.
It all sounds very romantic, but total fiction, I'm afraid. In the first instance, there was no North Atlantic when the seam was laid, and although both the Iberian and Pennsylvanian coal seams were laid down in a similar time period, they are not connected. I have no idea where the myth derives, beyond the fact that miners did show solidarity between each other, internationally, and every coal field has a famous seam. It is possible to realize those illustrations of seams and sediments in full 4K with the power of the drone, and a not-so-welcome surface mine in Merthyr. Despite the opposition it has generated with noise and pollution, it does present a fabulous opportunity to see the different strata. Starting with the lower, thicker seams, we can see the layers of clay, mudstone and sandstone. A 4-thick seam would originally have been 40 feet of plant material, peat in a swamp, forming over 10 or 20,000 years. As we move up the strata, so we turn pages that bring us to the end of the Carboniferous period. History written in stone, you can see the coal beds get thinner. At this point, Britain now was inland in a supercontinent of Pangaea and sailing north on its continental plate, moving into a more arid region of the tropics, the location of the world's deserts are today. The great forests receded into islands. Nature found a way. Whilst these shrinking rainforests and swamps were not great for the amphibians, the new kids on the block, the lizards, didn't seem to be held back, being able to traverse the more hostile drier land in between. They eventually evolved into dinosaurs. Sediments filling up the depression can be imagined rather like bowls stacked up. We can see the rim of the largest bowl, the red sandstone. This was followed by a thick layer of marine sediments of limestone, up to 1,000 meters thick, followed by millstone grits that vary in depth from 20 to 750 meters, and finally 15 million years of coal with intermediate deposits of mud, silt and sand. And that's over a kilometre thick in places, with the deepest coal seams over 1,000 meters deep. So, how was it possible that these sediments were able to keep flowing into a large geological basin and never filling up? Well, just as the movement of continental plates pushes up mountains from level plains or even deep oceans, so those same forces can create depressions. Rather like pizza dough, as you push it out to the edges, the middle thins out. And as those sediments accumulate, and they get hundreds of meters thick, they compress themselves under their own weight. And because so much of the ancient geology was formed at sea level, and during an ice age, which saw sea level rise, fall, and rise like some geological tide, so coal forest swamps were compressed, and then sank deeper into this continental plate. So what is underneath those kilometres of sandstone, limestone, millstone grip and coal measures? I guess elephants on the back of a turtle. As the Carboniferous came to an end, the Permian started. Britain was now landlocked in the supercontinent of Pangaea. During that period, bacteria and fungus caught up with tree evolution and evolved to be able to digest lignin. Hence, the creation of coal beds effectively came to an end, although there are some exceptions. This cutaway of the strata illustrates nicely how the first coal mines were developed. They started on the side of the hill and followed the seam, a drift mine. When that was exhausted, then a shaft would be sunk to find a suitable deep seam. The limitation for the early miners was how powerful the pumps were to keep the mine from flooding. The deeper you go, the more powerful the pumps need to be. As for iron ore, you can see the traces of iron deposits, rusty stains. Iron ore, which is found along with the coal along the edge of the South Wales coalfield, formed as bog iron ore, that is, dissolved iron and oxygen, in swamp water, collecting and lithifying to make an extremely heavy mudstone. This is a lumper found on the beach, and it's heavy. This form of iron ore is less common, although more accessible than banded iron deposits that make up the bulk of the world's reserves. It was demand for iron in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, with military being a major customer, that brought industrialists to the sleepy part of Wales. Major iron production centres such as the Forest of Dean were unable to keep up with demand. The other innovation, developed 50 years earlier by Abraham Darby in 1710, was the use of coal rather than charcoal. With such a high demand for iron, Britain faced an energy crisis. The coppices and woodlands could not keep up with supplying iron foundries. The problem with coal is that it contains a number of impurities, such as sulphur. Iron smelted with coal is brittle and pretty useless. Charcoal is almost pure carbon. Abraham Darby worked out that by burning coal first in a controlled way, it would turn into coke, driving off the oils and sulphur and making synthetic charcoal far cheaper than the foresters. This blast furnace a few miles east of Merthyr Tydfil demonstrates the early designs. An iron furnace is simply not a matter of melting the iron out of the rock. It's a series of chemical reactions. The furnace would be heated up with coke, and then from the top, layers of limestone, coke, and iron ore, the three key components found in the area, would be tipped into the top or the neck of the furnace at a constant rate to have a production line of reactions. Blasted with air from bellows, initially driven by water power and later preheated and driven by steam power. The coke, being mainly carbon, reacted with the air to create carbon monoxide. One carbon attached to one oxygen molecule, the heat would then melt the limestone, creating the flux, the carbon monoxide combining with the oxygen in the ore to form carbon dioxide, so liberating the iron, which would melt. Combining with the melted limestone, any silica or rock making up about half the ore would combine to form slag. The furnace would run continually, with iron being tapped off at the bottom, running into sand moulds. The term pig iron is a reference to the piglets suckling off the sow, and the furnace being constantly supplied with raw materials to keep the process running, the operation stopping when the fire bricks lining the furnace burnt out. Clay, being the fourth raw material suitable for making into heat-resistant fire bricks, is also found close to coal seams. Ancient, extremely fine sediment washed down and settling in stagnant water. Early steam power was static. The first engines were developed for pumping water out of mines. Thomas Newcomen developed the first steam pumps to keep tin mines in Cornwall dry. In 1712, although not particularly efficient, they were adapted especially for coal mines given the fuel was abundant. The Newcomen atmospheric engine reigned for 60 years. The Scottish inventor James Watt improved the design in 1776, and the efficiency, with the new model being snapped up by Cornish tin miners who did not have cheap coal to power the pumps. Richard Trevithick of Cornwall moved the technology on with high-pressure steam and much greater efficiency, allowing for miniaturization, his Puffing Devil being the first steam wagon. His achievements reliant on the fact that iron-making had also improved, and the fabrication of better, stronger, and more accurately engineered iron castings. The Panderen ironworks purchasing one to be static and to drive hammers. With the assistance of Rhys Jones, an employee of the ironworks, and under the supervision of Samuel Homfray, the proprietor, he mounted the engine on wheels and turned it into a locomotive in 1803. Homfray was so impressed with Trevithick's locomotive that he made a bet with another ironmaster, Richard Crashaw, for 500 guineas, which in today's money is about £50,000, and that Trevithick's steam locomotive could haul 10 tons of iron along the Merthyr Tydfil tramroad from Panderen to Abercynon, a distance of about 10 miles. Amid great interest from the public, on the 21st of February 1804, he successfully carried 10 tons of iron, 5 wagons, and 70 men the full distance in 4 hours and 5 minutes, average speed of about 2.5 miles an hour. Whilst Merthyr can claim to be the first steam railway, it was only for the one demonstration. In 1812, the Middleton Railway became the first commercial railway to use steam locomotives successfully, with Matthew Murray designing the engine, and it was also the first to kill a member of the public. The coal wagons on their iron rails continued to be pulled by horses for years to come. Merthyr can claim to be the first iron rail bridge, following on from the world's first iron road bridge of Coalbrookdale, built in 1781. The bridge was designed by Watkins George and built in 1793 for Cavava Ironworks to support both a tramway and an aqueduct. It was prefabricated, and versions were also made to cross the River Taff elsewhere. Merthyr became the world's biggest source of iron. You can see the wealth it brought the town, that grew into the most populated region of South Wales, with the public and religious buildings a sign of the town's former opulence, although some chapels were built in times when workers were laid off. Industrialization brought social change. Globalization brought instability to the economy. During the Napoleonic Wars, the iron foundries had done well, Lord Nelson even visiting Merthyr to see the Royal Naval guns being made. However, in 1825, there was a stock market crash, partly driven by the banks making risky loans, and in part by the biggest confidence trick in history. General Gregor MacGregor was a Scottish soldier and adventurer and conman, and he attempted, around 1821, to draw British and French investors and settlers to Poyas. It was a fictional Central American territory that he claimed to rule. Hundreds invested their savings in supposedly government bonds and land certificates, while about 250 emigrated to MacGregor's invented country in 1822, only to find untouched jungle, and more than half of them died. By May of 1831, the downturn in the economy and downturn in their pay led to workers, particularly those in the employ of William Crawshay, to take to the streets calling for higher wages and cheaper bread, as well as reform, and protesting at the levels of unemployment. By the end of the month, the protesters had sacked the local debtors' court, returning any goods that had been collected by bailiffs and destroying records of debt. The workers raised the red flag, topped it with a loaf of bread soaked in blood, and this was the first time flying the red flag was associated with workers and socialism. On the 1st of June, the protesters spread to neighbouring towns and mines. The government in London ordered the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders on foot to be dispatched and to restore order, but the crowds were too large and the soldiers were ordered to protect buildings and people. On the 2nd of June, a meeting of pit and foundry owners at the Castle Inn in central Merthyr was approached by the protesters' representative, Lewis. Their demands were rejected, leading to a full-scale riot, and the soldiers protecting the bosses, losing some of their weapons to the workers, which led to the soldiers opening fire. Many protesters were wounded, and some were killed. The bosses and the military retreated to Panderen House, the stately accommodation of the Homfray owners of Panderen Ironworks. The building was demolished in the 1950, and the town stadium occupies the grounds. For 8 days, Panderen House was the sole refuge of authority, with armed insurrection fully in place in the town by the 4th of June. The rioters had commandeered arms and explosives, set up roadblocks, and formed guerrilla detachments. On the road between Brecon and Merthyr, the rebels set up an ambush of the soldiers' baggage train and about 40 yeomanry escorting it, driving them into the hills in retreat. And they also drove off a relief force of yeomen from Swansea. By the 6th, 450 troops were sent in against a mass gathering in open ground above Dowlais, and the rebels dispersed. The protest was over. 24 protesters were killed, numerous protesters and soldiers injured. 26 protesters went on trial, faced with imprisonment and deportation, and 2 faced the death penalty. Lewis, a ringleader but charged with robbery, had his sentence downgraded to life in a penal colony in Australia after a police officer said he had been protected by Lewis from the mob. Dick Panderen, aged 24, was accused of stabbing and injuring a soldier in the leg with a seized bayonet. Despite calls for leniency and his own claim of innocence, he was hung. The British government wanted an example to be made. Revolution was a real fear for the establishment. The Peterloo Massacre in 1819, where a peaceful protest was broken up by cavalry, causing 18 deaths and 400 injured, prompted much public outcry, but news reporting of the Merthyr Risings was very much subdued. Merthyr's decline as a major iron centre came with a decline in iron ore resources. But foundries had closed as early as 1860s, despite the demand for rails for railways, the Dulles foundry supplying the railway building boom and even the rails for the Trans-Siberian Railway. And it had ensured its survival by converting to steel production. The World Wars saw demand spike for the war effort. In the Second World War, coal resources were used to make explosives for ICI in the town, and small arms manufactured by BSA for the war effort. Merthyr's fortunes towards the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century were tied to coal mines developed in the vicinity. One of the last deep coal mines locally, Tower Colliery, was saved from closure by the workers buying it out in the 1990s. They mined out the last of the coal, and it was closed in 2010. It's now a zip-line attraction. Post-war, the Hoover factory, manufacturing washing machines, restored the fortunes of the town, and at one point the factory employed 5,000 people.
Wash day? Just forget it.
It also made an early contribution to the EV revolution with Clive Sinclair's C5. By the 1990s, and more recent decades saw the workforce reduced to a few hundred and production of appliances come to an end. The town's latest reinvention is retail outlets. Merthyr has applied for city status. What the future holds will reveal itself in due course. I hope you have enjoyed a visit to a town that's not normally on the traveller's destination list. If you like this kind of content, please like, comment and subscribe, and check out my other videos.